So Season 2 of Tekken 8 has released, and the community is collectively burning itself to the ground right now. While I was initially going to make a video covering the backlash of the initial Tekken Talk stream, I decided to hold off and see how the patch actually played out, judging the community's response after the fact. Now that we have the actual patch notes in front of us and some time to experiment, it's safe to say that this patch has been a disaster for the game. In fact, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that this is some of the worst PR that the Tekken franchise has received since the infamous frame-dated DLC of Tekken 7. And though that case was a simple matter of corporate greed, in this case, it's a bit more nuanced. It seems like the Tekken team genuinely wants this game to be good, they just botched this patch in every way possible. I think there are two main reasons why this went so badly this time around. First, terrible communication on the part of the development team, and second, a design philosophy that's picked up a lot of traction amongst fighting game fans and developers in recent years. A philosophy that can only be described as the game design equivalent of toxic positivity. Starting with the first reason, I want to make something explicitly clear. Even if this patch turned out to have mostly positive changes and was well liked by the community, I still think that the initial backlash against the Tekken Talk stream was entirely the fault of the developers. This stream is just bad, for a number of reasons, from the misspelling special on the countdown screen, to the incredibly slow pacing due in part not only for the need for translation, but also sloppy presentation in general. But the worst offender of all was how these changes were presented and the focus on the quote-unquote positive character changes, prioritizing showing off new stuff rather than showing changes to the stuff we already have, which, mind you, was the primary thing that the community was looking for. I almost want to argue that this represents a fundamental disconnect on how the community viewed this patch in comparison to how the developers viewed this patch. The Tekken Talk almost seemed to be like a sort of DLC showcase, showing off brand new content that's to be added to the game later, similar to a typical live service release, viewing balance changes as more under-the-hood busy work that the community shouldn't really concern itself with too much. Instead, wanted to show cool new things that the developers added to the game. Meanwhile, the community viewed the patch as, well, a patch. Something to mend the growing pains of a dysfunctional meta. Sure, there might be buffs and new stuff, but the overall general point is to refine the game's systems to be better than the previous season, whilst ironing out character balance based on feedback, player data, and tournament results. Although there were some showcases of some much necessary changes for certain problem characters, the developers seem hell-bent on showing off as much new stuff as possible, despite the fact that the primary concern was that the game was too volatile in its current state. Yet the developers seem to acknowledge this in many of their comments. In fact, the maligned "focus on defense" tagline had become the primary meme of this update, though it's very tempting to assume that this is just the developers being a bit tone-deaf and maybe a bit out of touch with their community. I have to be skeptical of that fact as well, due to a baffling comment made about patch notes, or more specifically, the idea that the developers don't want to release patch notes early because they don't want the community to complain before they have their hands on the game, an idea that seems redundant at best. While Michael Murray and Harada have always been known for having a tongue-in-cheek at best, downright hostile at worst relationship with their game's community, considering that the community sentiment had already been fairly low for Tekken 8 recently, it probably wasn't a good idea to stir the pot so much. While it's important to understand that you can't take every single bit of feedback as gospel, you still have to keep your finger on the pulse of the community in general, especially when it comes to the live chat of your game's presentation. Yes, people over-exaggerate buffs and nerfs, that's true, but it doesn't change the fact that the community is fairly unified in their issues with the game. People have the same complaints. As a developer, expressing a sort of exacerbated fear of the general community's response to patch notes just gives people the impression that they're not going to like what they have to see in the first place, which ultimately turned out to be true. Go figure. The stream just wasn't pleasant to watch for a number of reasons, but most of all, it was one of the worst previews for a patch probably ever seen in fighting game history, and it soured the community's impression of what Season 2 of Tekken was going to be like, to the point where Nakatsu literally had to go into Twitter to re-emphasize that there were positive changes made for the game defensively. Which is true. The Season 2 patch did have tangibly good, if not amazing, changes to the game, but listing those changes wouldn't even matter at this point, due to how overwhelmingly negative the reception of the other changes were. While I'm not naive enough to believe that the developers were going to meaningfully soften the blow of this patch, considering just how many changes people strongly dislike, at the very least, they could have avoided poisoning the well beforehand. To be clear, I do think that the dev team is listening. While yes, it's a funny meme, I do think that they are sincere when it comes to trying to balance the game out defensively. If anything, I wouldn't be surprised if they had already committed to a large amount of changes prior to the community response, and just wanted to express that they are listening before things go haywire. But of course, that's just speculation on my part. But bad PR wasn't the primary reason why this patch went bad. We have to talk about the apparent design philosophy going into this patch, and the design of many fighting games in general as of late. Well, personally, I don't always agree with the volume of complaints in regards to Tekken 8. For one thing, I don't want Heat to be removed. I also share the primary complaint of essentially anybody still invested in the game. Though people may use different words to describe this, I think the number one term that best describes the issue with Tekken 8 is power creep. Tekken has always been an iterative franchise by nature, never really shaking the pot too much between releases, rather simply adding in changes to characters for the sake of balance, maybe a few new moves here and there to spice things up a little bit, and usually some sort of major refinement on the core systems, but never anything that diverges too far from what people expect from the franchise following Tekken 5's massive success. To put this into perspective, Tekken 8's Season 2 patch is the size equivalent of an entirely new Tekken game. That's how many changes were made in this patch alone. And that's also how iterative these releases tend to be. Because of this, besides things like meta changes, you tend to not see too much variation between Tekken games. That doesn't necessarily mean they all play the same, mind you, but that the changes are more subtle in nature to the outside viewer. This is not the case in Tekken 8, however. It's very clear from this game's presentation and its focus on more divisive mechanics, this game was supposed to be one that distinguished itself from the rest of the franchise, and not just having a unique identity, but also a substantially changed experience. There's just one problem, however. Everything is just too strong in this game. Even the weakest characters in Tekken 8 are essentially A tier, which might sound like a good thing at first. Surely that's a mark of good balancing after all. And to be clear, Season 1 of Tekken 8, at the very least, was a balanced game. Sure, there were outliers in terms of abnormally strong characters, but overall the game was balanced. Every character was strong, but that's not the issue. The problem is that if you take any character from Tekken 8 and put them into Tekken 7, they would be S tier even if you remove their heat mechanics. It's not an exaggeration to say that we're playing supercharged variants of some of the strongest versions of existing Tekken characters. Now this isn't inherently bad per se. The biggest problem comes with the addition of heat. In many ways, while heat is a neat mechanic that adds in a lot of identity for characters, it's also one of the most undeveloped mechanics in a weird paradoxical sense. Because heat doesn't seem to neatly fit into Tekken's core systems in a way that seems natural. The best way I could describe it is that Tekken 8 already has incredibly powerful versions of Tekken 7 characters, with new moves and buffs to boot, but then it has heat on top of it as a bonus. It doesn't give the impression that these characters are designed around the additional buffs that are given to them with heat included as well. Rather, they just had heat kind of slapped onto them. In fact, if a developer interview came out saying that heat was something that was actually added far later into development, I don't think many people would be surprised. That's how sloppily heat's implementation of the game has been so far. And if you look at early Tekken 8 footage, heat was going to be far worse than it is now. So what you have is a game where every single character is buffed beyond belief, with an additional offensive system added on top of each character that gives them incredibly powerful moves to use. That's essentially the definition of power creep. Tekken 8 can be a fun game to play, and Season 1 probably wasn't as bad as many people made it out to be, especially in light of what Season 2 brought to the table. But overall, the meta of Tekken 8 can only be described as volatile. I'm not even necessarily advocating for a return to Tekken 7 like some people might. I'm not exactly the biggest fan of the backdash into whiff punish, counter hit launcher meta that essentially defined Tekken 7. And aside from some absurd damage toward the end of the game's life and power creep DLC characters, there was a sense of stability in Tekken 7's overall meta that made the game very safe to play. Tekken 8 on the other hand just has far too much snowballing included. But why even do all of this? Why go so far to radically increase the game's overall power? Well, I would blame this on a design philosophy that seems to be getting a lot of traction in fighting games over the past few years. And that's the idea that buffs are always better than nerfs. Now let's get the obvious out of the way. Yes, buffs are far sexier than nerfs. It always feels good to add something to a game rather than take something away, or at the very least, increasing the power of something. But I really want to push against this idea that nerfing something is somehow an omission of failure and is a negative addition to a game. This idea, in my opinion, especially doesn't work in a series like Tekken. Here's the thing, weaknesses often define a fighting game character more than strengths. Whenever a fighting game releases and people have deciphered the meta, i.e. the optimal way of playing the game, by proxy, they also discover the strongest tools and what defines a good character. You're going to find that your top tiers tend to be people who have the strongest toolkit with the most optimal tools within that meta. Using Street Fighter 6 as an example, some things that define a good character would be a low forward that can be cancelled into drive rush, a good throw loop, a good anti-air, some sort of invincible reversal, and drive rush fireball. If your character has even half of these things, they're already decent. But if they have all of these things, they're an amazing character. Sure, there are exceptions, but in general, we know what makes a good character in Street Fighter 6 at this point. However, the more interesting part of designing a character in this context is what you're going to take away from them to compensate for these additional tools. Examples might include a glass cannon character who has low HP, or a zoner with extremely poor offense or no reversal. You get the idea. Tekken is a series that benefits incredibly from characters having tangible weaknesses. Oftentimes, it gives characters distinct playstyles that define them. As a Jin main, a large part of his identity in Tekken 7 was the fact that although he had amazing tools for every situation, he had a very limited amount of tools for each situation, and required discipline and mastery over the character to optimize his toolkit for each individual situation. However, come Tekken 8 Season 1, Jin had buttons so overtuned that he evolved into a character that would just rely on a few key moves that were far too strong, the most notable of course being Scourge. I think you're getting the general idea. Ever since Season 2 of Tekken 7, the development team have had a habit of patching holes in characters' kit that probably shouldn't be touched. If not that, then supercharging their existing toolkits to the point where their weaknesses don't really seem to matter anymore, as they just bulldog their way toward a win using the same generic flowchart that everybody seems to use. I don't think the community wants Tekken to go back to being an incredibly defensive game like Tekken 7 per se. I think people just want a healthy balance between the new offensive abilities added into the game and some sort of mitigating factor to upset that offense. It's not just enough to make every single character strong. If every single character is too strong, then each match starts to feel like a single player game, where every character is just trying to do their thing, essentially bulldozing their way to victory. Fighting games should be about meaningful interactions between both players. A notable example of a game that took character individuality in terms of strength too far is DNF Duel, and that game paid the price for it. As paradoxical as it might seem, it's very possible for a game where every character is extremely strong to be boring, because ultimately, the strongest ability that you can have in a fighting game is to take away your opponent's ability to play the game at all, something that seems far more prevalent in Tekken 8. While I won't go as far as to try to come up with my own independent solution of how to neatly tie Heat into the other mechanics of Tekken, I'll just give a general idea of the direction I'd like to see Heat go in. There needs to be more meaningful decision making when it comes to using Heat. Heat shouldn't just be a bonus that characters get on top of their existing kit. Sure, both characters have access to it at any time, so the playing field is technically even, but again, that's not the point. The problem right now is that Heat is both mindless and powerful, the worst combination you can get for these games. While I can't pinpoint how exactly the system might work, I do think that Heat needs to be a resource that is more meaningfully maintained throughout a match. Perhaps create ways to eliminate an opponent's Heat before they can use it, or add a condition before activating Heat, or adding some sort of downside for using Heat, or just lowering the overall power of Heat. Either way, Heat can't just be a powerful bonus that every character gets for free. It's just too volatile of a system. What the devs were thinking for doubling down on some of the most problematic aspects of Heat, I can't say for sure. But it's safe to say that this update was a categorical failure, and the Steam reviews rightfully reflect this. Sorry my thoughts weren't as organized in this video. I'm making this on incredibly short notice. Also, shoutouts to everybody who watched my previous video. It was a massive success, and I couldn't have done it without you guys. Until next time, take care.